Good day, my name is Frederick Malmstrom. I'm a psychologist and gave this talk originally to the Amazing Conference 4, which was in Las Vegas in 2006. And since the videotape that they had never was processed at the time, go ahead and redo this because this is rather by popular demand. What the topic is about UFO aliens, and I guarantee you, if you are looking for any kind of publicity from anywhere, there's no money in this, but if you want publicity, all you have to do is tell a newspaper reporter that you saw a UFO. And the title of this presentation is called "In Close Encounters We Mostly See Ourselves." There has been quite a bit of, recently on television, of the numbers of so-called science programs, especially on the History Channel, of UFO aliens that have landed, and it is amazing how many people want to buy into this. The In Close Encounters, of course, was a term invented by the late Allen Hynek, the astronomer from Northwestern University, who was called upon by the Air Force, so maybe 50 years ago, to do explanations of UFOs, or unidentified flying objects. And he's often asked, did you believe such things as UFOs? And he said, of course there are things as UFOs, because otherwise they would be called IFOs. So with that, we'll proceed with this. Now, In Close Encounters We Mostly See Ourselves was originally with a colleague of mine named Richard Kaufman that we got into this because there was a comment given to us by the astronomer Carl Sagan that said all UFO occupants look alike. We thought this was a kind of a funny statement, but we decided to look into this further. And with the Close Encounters hypothesis in mind, we came up, well, there must be a way to test this, why all UFO occupants look alike. And the hypothesis here states simply was scientific investigation said all alien faces are an internally generated facial recognition template which are present at birth. So what we'll do is go through this presentation and find out what people see and how it is broken down, and what an infant or a baby sees, and how this template perhaps is generated in the body in the infant's mind at birth. So originally we started off as being what it was called, originally I was an ergonomist, which means a human factors engineer, and I later became a clinical psychologist, was that we took a look at the human body, and the human body is really not well constructed. They say, like with the human back from evolution, says that there are only two types of people in this world, those who have bad backs and those who are going to have bad backs. And you know, the human retina of the eye, for instance, is backwards because all the light sensing cells are faced backwards in the eye, where like an octopus, they're faced forward. So what we did was merely construct what a UFO alien ought to look like versus what we look like. You know, we as human beings are called bipedal, what we call bipedal humanoids. And we took a look at through evolution over billions of years, say if the animals, say a fish had evolved from the sea in a slightly different way, we might come up with something we call here a bimanous monopedal kangaroid, because it turned out that the more efficient way of getting around is not bipedally, walking with one foot in front of the other, but by hopping. And if you ever take a look at the oxygen consumed by a kangaroo, it's really quite efficient. And even little baby lemurs like to leap around with hopping. And this little animal that we had just constructed here was called a bimanous monopedal kangaroid, which meant it had two arms and it had only 1 foot, but it was constructed mainly by getting around by hopping. It's quite efficient. And we redesigned the whole, I guess, human template into something that would be much more efficient for moving around. You can see this, that it has a large ear horn placed at the top for directionalizing sound. It has little olfactory pits around there so you can tell even the direction of smells come from. And it has a single eye which will go back and forth like this to eliminate binocular vision, so you just have one eye, which is serves the same purpose as moving your head from side to side to judge distance. And we did have a mouth there, and we were able on the arms to, we couldn't get around having two arms on this bimanous monopedal kangaroid, but we were able to cut down the fingers from number 5 fingers to 3 to make dexterity. And you take a look at the feet there, it's actually a fish that has evolved from the water and learned out by hopping on its tail. And it can actually move about 30 kilometers per minute, which is pretty darn fast, and it's very efficient. With science fiction authors such as the classic H.G. Wells, from Ray Bradbury to Isaac Asimov, you find that all their characters that are extraterrestrials are not necessarily humanoid, with the 2 legs, 2 arms, and a head on them. They could be sponge-shaped blobs that move around. So anyway, when we decided that what was an appropriate extraterrestrial, at least for moving in an Earth-like type gravity, we decided to design this, and this has received a fair amount of attention. But what we decided was to find out which types of characters that the human mind was capable of comprehending, especially when a newborn infant. Now, when you say all UFO occupants look alike, we were fortunate enough at the time, Richard Kaufman and myself, that he was in the Air Force station in Tucson, Arizona, and he had access to the files of the late ufologist Jim and Coral Lorenzen, who kind of ran a kitchen table type of operation for collecting case studies and drawings of people who had claimed to have seen UFOs. This is a little bit more extensive than the late, I guess, charlatan Adamski, who used a chicken brooder that he had somehow photographed out of focus and passed this off as a UFO. Jim and Coral Lorenzen were largely self-educated, but at least they were well-meaning. And what we did was go through the files that they had. There are numerous of these scattered around their house, and we picked out the characteristics of persons who had had the close encounters of the third kind and had seen UFO occupants, and we picked out the most common characteristics of about a sample of 30. And the statement, again, from Carl Sagan was that we came up with what was pretty much a standard UFO occupant. Now, if you look at this next one, these are published accounts of famous cases which have been spotted, at least described by those who claim to have been abducted or encountered by UFO aliens or occupants. And look at that center one, which is the very famous Travis Walton case from Wyoming. Oh, it must have happened about 40 years ago, where he had claimed to have been abducted in the woods in Wyoming and for about 3 days and was missing. Well, the late Martin Gardner, who was a great skeptic, did some investigation into this, and it turned out that maybe Travis Walton had found a convenient reason to disappear because he was under contract from the U.S. government at the time to clear a forest or a certain patch of land, and he was falling behind in his contract, would have been under penalty. So this was an act of God, I guess, that intervened with this, and he got conveniently abducted by a UFO alien for about 3 days or a week before he finally reappeared. But Travis Walton since then has made a lot of news, I guess. Again, there's no money in this, but there's plenty of fame that he got too. Anyway, you can see that the others, all of these UFO occupants, nearly all of them have a humanoid type shape. And what I mean by humanoid, it's 2 legs, 2 arms, a body, and some kind of head placed on it. And if you think humanoids are not that unusual, take a look at any of the cartoon characters like Walt Disney and Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse is really not a Mickey Mouse. He's more like a humanoid mouse. He walks on 2 legs and has 2 arms, and one does not normally encounter a mouse that's walking on his hind legs with oversized ears. So this is our composite, and we did this with the artist's husband here, who happens to fit the description of, I guess, the average U.S. male. Now, the average U.S. male turns out to be just about 5'9", 5 feet 9 inches tall, and perhaps weighing about 160 pounds. And we compared this against the composite of this. About 80% of the times, these humanoids were mentioned as the UFO occupants of being roughly about 5 feet tall to about 5 feet 2, of a grayish or greenish complexion with an oversized head and the wraparound bulbous eyes and little or no facial features of nose or ears and some kind of long fingers. This one, for example, was published in the San Jose newspaper, and this hit the national news wires back when we did this original study about 1978 or 1979. And lo and behold, you wouldn't believe the numbers of phone calls I was getting from around the world, people saying, do you believe this or that? And I said, no, what really is more, this is like a debunking type thing, but people wouldn't believe that, and they said, lo and behold, you had been abducted by a UFO, which was not the case. But again, anybody that wants notoriety, just go down to your local paper or news station and tell me you've seen a UFO with a little green man running around, and you will get phone calls that you never thought you would get. So the UFO occupant, if you take a look at this next slide, this is what I did was take a look at the height distribution. You know, what the tallest man versus the tallest, the shortest man versus the average man, and this is what we plotted out from the U.S. Census data, that the average man stands roughly about 5'9", and the average female roughly stands about 5'2". That's at least for the United States. And if you look at these two distributions, from called a normal curve distribution, turns out that roughly the 5th percentile male, or the shortest 5% of males, is actually about the 95th percentile of the tallest females. So there's really not much overlap between these two distributions. Now you see down from these little squares here, this was the UFO height distribution that we estimated from these descriptions from the 30 or so cases we did, and you can see they're all over the place, really spread out, where the U.S. female, for instance, is a rather narrow distribution. Females will normally average about 95% of them roughly between 5 feet tall and maybe 5'6". So what I did was overlay these, and I did a statistical test called a chi-square, and it turned out really there was a difference between the average, or I say the distribution of the average male and the average UFO occupant. But what I didn't realize at the time was there was no statistical difference between the height distribution of females, American females, and these UFO occupants, which is something I'll get into a little bit later. Now, as far as beliefs of UFOs, I'll relate a little embarrassing experience that I had about my own abduction by a UFO. First time I gave this, people said, "Oh, really?" And I said, "No, wait until I explain." What happened was, this was 1965, that I was driving late one morning, about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, on the freeway, on the interstate between Austin, Texas and Waco, Texas, back to where I was living at the time, Waco, Texas. And of course I was an Air Force lieutenant at the time, and I was big and brave, and I thought I could stand anything. And there I was, alone by myself on this freeway, driving down, half falling asleep, and the sky around me suddenly started turning, all over the car, started turning a grayish green glow, and this, that sparkles in front of me too. And it was like little gold spots in front of me too. And at that time, after observing this for about 5 minutes, I decided at that time, well, if the UFO aliens come to get me, I'm not going to struggle. I'm just going to go along with them too. And this kept up for about 20 minutes. And honestly, I can tell you that I was absolutely terrified out of my skin. I was scared out of my pajamas, but I kept on driving. And after about, it seemed like 20 minutes or a half hour, probably a lot less, that it disappeared, and I went on and finished that, and I had no explanation until I looked in the papers the next day, and lo and behold, the U.S. Army from Fort Hood had been flying along the freeway and dropping experimental flares through the overcast. And there is some saying of the skeptics, when they come up with a conclusion, if I hadn't have believed it, I wouldn't have seen it. Most people say if I hadn't have seen it, I wouldn't have believed it, but it's the other way around. I was fully prepared to believe this, and at the time I fully believed I was about to be abducted by a UFO. Now in the years subsequent to that and flying, I have flown many times over North Vietnam in combat, and I have dodged surface-to-air missiles and flak and bullets and everything else. It's nowhere near the terror that I experienced when I was on the freeway that one day, flying, driving in my little Chevrolet toward Waco, Texas. So, I have several case studies that I have looked at. This particular one is the, I guess, typical UFO face. It was given to me by the late Robert Baker from the University of Kentucky, who had written quite a few skeptic articles and I guess journals, and had an extensive file of UFO occupants that have been experienced. And this is a UFO occupant face, which is given to me by Robert Baker. And you can see it as a typical UFO face, kind of an elongated gray face, no ears, 2 large eye spots, the wraparound eyes and the bald head, and little or no nose features too. This is the one by Bob Bakers. And he gave me another one. This is actually, if it were in color, there's a kind of a reddish glow to this, but you see the two eye spots, the no nose, and the bulbous head that go along with it. And lo and behold, later on, I happened to have one of my own patients, when I became a clinical psychologist, that actually drew me a picture. And she had been, awakened from a dream, and lo and behold, there was a UFO occupant standing over her and doing this kind of nodding at her, and it was the identical type of, I guess typical, or I guess prototypical UFO face. Now, going through the case of what the average, I guess the template in the face is, let's go back, do a little ethological studies, or what I mean by the study of animal behaviors. What is the brain of a newborn, either bird or squirrel or human being? What is it prepared to see? Well, this is some very famous studies by the Nobel Prize winning ethologist or animal behaviorist Nico Tinbergen, who did back in the 1940s and 1950s, of shadow patterns and presenting them to newly hatched chicks just out of the shell. So there's no doubt these chicks haven't learned anything. And if you take a shadow pattern like this and flash it in front of a newborn chick, they will automatically cower underneath the wings of their mother. Okay, I mean, they will run and chirp like crazy and get out of there. Now, take a look at the configuration of this. This has the wings up on front and the small tail behind. If you take this shadow pattern and flash this in front of chicks, guess what? They ignore it. Now, it depends on which direction it's going, because if it's going from the bottom of the screen up toward the top of the screen, the chicks will ignore it. But if it goes the other way, where you have the wings in front and the tail behind, the chicks will cower from this one too. So this is one template that is pre-wired in newly hatched chicks. And it's a very useful survival thing, because if you see this particular one on top of the so-called hawk or eagle pattern, and you cower from this, you're much likely to survive than if you run away from this, which is a false alarm too. Now, this is something else, and this is what human beings are predisposed to see. And this is some very interesting studies done by the late Eckhard Hess from the University of Chicago, who did studies in what is called pupillometry. And pupillometry means nothing more than they observe the size of the human pupils, which they'll dilate, say just millimeters, one large to small, over, say, being exposed to emotional type stimuli. And one of the original experiments he did, of course, was flash Playboy fold-out pictures of, attractive young ladies in various states of dress, and he would flash them in front of, healthy American males, and he found out whenever they, had a picture of an attractive lady, the pupils of the males would dilate considerably, and if they showed them something else, like perhaps a scene of a woodland, or something like, something disgusting, like, a rotten hunk of garbage, the pupils would actually constrict. And what he did was merely give two spots and show these to human beings, both male and female, and it turned out that the larger the spot is, the larger the two spots are, the more likely they are to attract the attention of young babies. There are people who, in advertising, obviously specialize in pupillometry, and they want to find out whether their advertisements are appealing or whether they're not, or whether they turn people off. And when you take a look at these two spots, one spot won't do it, three spots won't do it, it's always two spots. And with the young infants, newborn infants, they'll find what they pay attention to and what they don't. And this goes a long way toward explaining why people see faces that aren't there. You will see a face in the moon, or people will see the Virgin Mary in a potato chip, because it's normally those two spots that grab the attention of individuals. And these two spots, the larger the spots, the more they attract the attention. The smaller the spots, the less they attract attention. And Eckhard Hess made quite a bit of fame by discovering this. It's the two spots and the two eyes that grab people's attention from a very early age on through the rest of your life. If you see one eye, it doesn't do much. Three eyes don't do it, but it's always the two spots, and they're always placed horizontally. Now, they did experiments with babies, okay, and they took a look at prototypical faces, and these, this is C.A. Nelson and one of her colleagues back in the 1990s did experiments with young children, and they took with females only. Beards won't work that well, but you got to have someone without a beard. And if you wrap the head so that you don't show the ears and the hair, that these are much more likely to attract a baby's attention than not. Okay. And of course, the outstanding feature of this are the two eyes. And this deals with something called mental imagery. Now we get into something, there's a very famous, I guess, interesting process called prosopagnosia. This is a fancy way of saying that some people, through injury or they're born that way, are unable to recognize faces. It's not at all unusual people not being able to recall names, but there's famous cases of people who've been injured in battle, and right back here in the back of the brain, somewhere between the visual and the called the occipital and the parietal cortex, there's a little area of the brain about the size, less than the size of the joint in your little finger, called the fusiform gyrus, which is responsible for recognizing faces. And individuals who have injuries back there simply cannot recognize faces. The physician Oliver Sacks, who has written numerous books and quite interesting books and easy to understand, is a prosopagnosiac himself. And quite embarrassing, one day he found himself talking to a person next to him in a restaurant, and it was about 10 minutes in before he realized he was talking to his own reflection in the mirror, because he could not even recognize his own face. The famous case of a German soldier in World War II was injured back there, and he was shown a picture of a German shepherd and asked what he thought of it. He said it was kind of a face with curious hair, and that's all he could make out of it. You can recognize other things in a person. You can recognize the gait, the weight, and their how they walk and what they're wearing, and hear the voice, and you can instantly recognize them then, but simply they cannot recognize face. So facial recognition is a very specialized modular area of the brain. And modularity has become the fashion rather recently. There's a psychologist by the name of Stephen Kurzban who said the brain is actually collected in different areas, modules of the brain, one which can do this and one which can't do that, whether it's recognizing, say, a specific color, a specific shape, or even with specific emotions where you have them in the brain that one might conflict with the other. This is the theory of modularity, which is gaining some prominence, and I must say I'm quite a fan of this. Now, if we go back to the original template in the human brain, I've done a fair amount of research with my former professor and mentor, Robert Weber, in mental imagery. Now, what is mental imagery? That is mainly what you were talking about, the ability to construct images in your mind's eye. If I asked you to think about an apple, or I don't care, Doris Day, or the Kardashians, you will get some image that will come up in your mind. Now, this I came across in an old cartoon. This is Mandrake the Magician, where he's asking a witness to reconstruct a mental image of someone he has seen. Well, this is not exactly what I'm talking about, with the mental imagery. You can flash this on a screen and come up with a face, witness to a crime. It makes interesting cartoons, but I don't think this is the way it is done. So we'll take a little bit closer look at imagery. Now, we did find out through research that if you deal with mental imagery, and the first time I mentioned this to my mother, who is a professor herself, he said, "What are you doing in the way of research?" And I said, "We're measuring the size and the shape and the speed of mental images." The first thing she said to me is, "Oh, Fred, really?" Well, actually, it turns out that mental images do have particular sizes and preferred shapes. If you are to imagine an apple in front of you, it normally comes out about maybe 2 or 3 degrees width. And you don't imagine an apple that big, and you don't imagine a giraffe that big. They all seem to be one standard size. And we come up with a conclusion there, very positively correlated. And a fellow named Stephen Kostlin at Harvard also has done work in this. It turns out that mental images have discrete sizes and shapes and preferential, and when you imagine something, it comes out to be a particular size. And this is all I'm saying here from the studies. You see that mental images have a discrete, measurable size, a depth of focus, they're only in so far and out so far, and a speed which they operate at. Now let me introduce you to something else called spatial vision. With spatial vision, and you have to bear with me on this, that spatial vision is not something that's intuitively obvious to the average human being. So this is research that have been done well, starting over like 40 years ago when they started doing deblurring of photographic objects, such as in crime photographs or aerial photographs or satellite photographs, which the eye is more preferential to pick up. Deals with spatial vision, where the human eye and the visual system preferentially picks up objects of a certain size. Normally it comes about 3 objects or bars, discrete bars, per visual angle. When I talk about visual angle, if you hold your arm out like this at arm's length and look at your thumb subtends a visual angle of about 1 degree, a visual angle. And if you place 360 of your thumbs all the way around you, it'll circle you all the way, so 1 degree of that. And you will see about 3 bars or 3 objects in front of you preferentially, such as the eye is attuned, at least the human eye is attuned to seeing an object roughly about the size of a dried pea more than anything else. And if I were to hold a comb out in front of me, which may have a dozen or more little bars in front of me, the eye is not nearly so preferential to that, or that, say, of a golf ball held at arm length, as it would to 3 separate little dried peas held side by side by side. And this is called spatial vision. You can see from this graph that the greatest sensitivity of the human vision is about 3 of these little bars per visual angle degree. And if I take 3 little dried peas side by side in my thumb, the eye is more likely to pick that out, or is more sensitive to that than it is to anything else. And that's a hockey-shaped graph on the top of there too. And the reason that I say this is because if you look at animals here, and this is not too clear, but you see animals like human beings and our closest relatives, the primates, chimpanzees and rhesus monkeys and squirrel monkeys, they're all attuned to seeing 3 discrete objects per degree. And if you look way down at the bottom here of these grosser type objects, the humans, one of their favorite pets, the cat, is attuned to seeing only like 1 object per degree. And you go up way on the other end, you see like owls and birds are much more attuned to seeing like 5 or 10 or 15, which deals with what's called visual acuity. The reason that this bar is, these bars are so finely spaced, human beings, they are called diurnal animals. What I mean by diurnal animals, you and I are daytime animals. We don't operate so well as night as we do during the day. If you look down at the bottom, you see owls and you see cats. Cats are actually nocturnal animals. This is why people have a lot of trouble in cats as pets, because the cat always wants to bounce around at night and sleep during the day. And you see that the vision evolution has attuned this to certain types of spatial frequencies, you see. Now, human faces, where we get in, finally we go full circle on human faces. The reason that I say human faces is because the human brain is attuned to seeing faces at 3 cycles per degree. And if you take a look at this individual here, most people, the first time they look at that, don't recognize, but I say if you squint at it, the object will immediately become apparent to most of us and what that is. Obviously it's Abraham Lincoln, but why, when squinting at it, makes more obvious than if you don't squint at it, is because if you squint at it, your eye is actually filtering out the low spatial frequencies and the high spatial frequencies, and is tuning only on the medium-sized spatial frequencies. I'll give you a while to look at that, but this was a famous article published by Harmon and Hulish from Bell Labs back in the 1970s. And it turns out that facial recognition, by golly, it is attuned to the area of 3 cycles per degree. And what we decided to do here was, with the demonstration here, is to take human faces and cut them down to 3 cycles per degree of spatial frequency. As an interesting case study, for example, there's the famous case of Betty and Barney Hill. Now, Betty and Barney Hill, if you ever come across the book Interrupted Journey, or the famous movie, I guess, with James Earl Jones on the Interrupted Journey, this was a couple that was driving in New Hampshire in 1961 and claimed that they were abducted by UFO aliens. And Betty had gone off, I guess, reported later she was having terrible dreams, and she went off and saw a psychiatrist about three years later, and she was hypnotized, and she came up with this prototypical type face of a UFO occupant. And my wife, bless her heart, had actually had a chance to converse with Betty Hill's ex-husband. And her ex-husband, because Betty was actually a neighbor of mine in New Hampshire when we were living there, and her ex-husband said, you know, Betty believed in UFOs long before she was ever abducted, which is something that never came out in the books. And Betty Hill actually went off to a psychiatrist named Benjamin Simon in Boston and was hypnotized him almost 3 years later, and this is the story she came up with. Now, with prosopagnosia and facial recognition, if this is the type of template that the human being is born with, I've got to say that 2.5 years or 3 years later to become hypnotized and call up this image is not all that reliable, because a lot of people will see these UFO-type faces, especially when they're just waking up from a deep sleep. It's called hypnagogic imagery, if you want to increase your vocabulary in that one. And again, this prototypical face is something that came up after hypnosis. Now, we took this particular template that we looked at. This is one of my colleagues at the time. She was in the economics department, Jen Krischer, a major, and she decided to volunteer her face for this. And you're looking for a female face that you want to transfer. You want to transform this into a 3 cycle per degree prototypical face. And what you are looking for, what does a baby see? A newborn baby. Newborn babies are preferentially attuned to seeing 3 cycles per degree. They are attuned to seeing not colors, but either grays or black and white, and they are attuned to seeing 2 spots or eyes. So we took her face and transformed it in what we are assuming here would be the template face which a newborn infant sees. Now, a newborn infant, it is well known that will respond almost to any face up to the age of 6 weeks, and they will respond equally happily to a Halloween mask or a skull or a mother's face. And what is it in the mother's face that you see would be very preferential to survival, of course, is the 2 eyes that stick out. So we started transforming this, and we're whittling this face down, getting rid of the fun, simply by transform, mainly look at the eyes and the nose and the mouth. Okay. And the first transform here, we cut this down with 3 cycles per degree. This is Jen's face here, simply by a process of blurring, or you can put it through a spatial frequency filter. This is the first one, but what you want to do is trim out the high spatial frequencies, you know, the fine details there, because that's not what the eye responds to best well. And this is the final product here. And wow, does that look like a UFO face to you? And the answer is most of us say yes, we think that's so. The next one here, say, well, okay, this is a Caucasian American female. How about other races and skin color? So we grabbed someone else in the hall, and we got a young lady here, Asian American, and we decided to transfer her face to spatial frequency analysis, and this is what we came up with. Lo and behold, same type of thing. So we took an African American female from the Department of Management, did this, and we decided to transfer her, and this is even spookier because the hair comes down, shouldn't be there, but you see, you know, the hair doesn't make that much difference, but the eyes stand out, and this is the transform you come up with. And I encourage anyone else who wants to do this type of research, take and transform these faces. You will find, first of all, that a newborn infant preferentially responds to those eyes, and they ignore everything else. You know, the human infant doesn't add in other textures like, you know, the such as the ears or hair, and doesn't respond nearly as well to a male with a beard, but they do with this type of, you know, of clean-shaven face, and that's what they respond to. It had been my pleasure for 3 days back in 1974 at the Academy. I was assigned as Carl Sagan's escort around the Academy, and I had 3 delightful days with this man. And in his typical way of, I guess, his way of responding with words, he had a use of words that I've never encountered with anyone else, that he could take any subject and tune it to so you could understand it. And the inevitable question was, you know, cadets or others would ask, what do you think of UFO aliens, you know, and UFO, you know, Von Däniken and others. And he looked up at the sky in a dark night, And with this typical, I guess, characteristic explosive emphasis on the first consonant of the word, he said, these types of beliefs are monuments to human credulity. And people, you know, if they want to believe it, they will. You know, if they are tuned to believe it, and this is one thing in the human psyche, I guess, in the human mind, the visual system, you are pre-tuned to recognizing a face like this. Now, this was, again, from Mandrake the magician, and the amazing. He said, amazing, how did you do it? Telepathy, I just pictured what in each man's mind. Well, there's no magic about this. And to leave you off with something else, I will say that, again, the original hypothesis, alien faces are an internally generated facial recognition present at birth. And I encourage any of you who are interested in this to follow up research on this, because it's been quite fruitful. I say there's no money in it, but you get plenty of notoriety out of it. And the last thing is, I want to show you a picture of a bona fide infant born of a first identified UFO alien, which is Jen Krischer, and this is Noah Krischer. So this is the first baby that I know of born to an extraterrestrial. Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate your attention.